Hi, this is Gary Meece. Sorry for the sound effects. Actually, some of them were intentional and some of them weren't. But I kind of like it. We'll see how it sounds. I'm going to read. I'm back again with the case against. I'm going to read relatively brief chapter concerning Damien Echols after he returned from his foray in Oregon, where he stayed with his family for a couple of weeks and ended up in a mental hospital, and they sent him home because they were scared of him. This is in 1992, August and September. The title of the chapter from my book Blood on Black is Broke Probation, Sucking the Blood, Frightening the Community Members. I've also got two other books on the West Memphis 3, a condensed version of the first two books called The Case Against the West Memphis 3 Killers, and a second volume, companion volume to Blood on Black, called Where the Monsters Go. Basically, I did two volumes to cover the case, and then I condensed and revised all the information down into a single volume. Anyway, my throat's a little sore this week. I'm hoping that that's the only problem I have in terms of sound. And here we go. A homesick Damien Echols returned to Arkansas. Echols later told friends that a Satanic priestess followed him from Oregon with the intent of either murdering him or pulling him back into the cult. I guess this is some sort of witch cult that he was referring to. It's not really clear from the record what cult he was talking about, but he was certainly involved in some witchcraft cults. And the whole deal with the Satanic priestess seems to be a figment of his imagination, but it's just hard to know with the paucity of verification on, what he actually meant and how, the testing of his reality was, not the best when it came to what he would tell his friends. It sounds like something he was just sort of bragging about to his friends, frankly, and a strange sort of brag. In his 2001 affidavit, Dr. George Woods, who did this examination of Echols while he was in prison for the defense, described Echols' circumstances. Quote, Mr. Echols was completely incapable of caring for himself when he returned to Arkansas. He had no money, and his mental illness and lack of skills and experience prevented him from working. He lived on the streets and even stayed at the home of his abusive stepfather, Andy Echols, a few nights. Within days, he was identified by his probation officer, who believed that Mr. Echols should be treated in a long-term residential psychiatric facility. The probation officer had Mr. Echols detained in the juvenile facility for violating his parole by returning to Arkansas. Staff and residents at the facility described Mr. Echols as losing touch with reality. His behavior deteriorated drastically. One resident reported he observed Mr. Echols, quote, sucking the blood off the scratch that another inmate had on his arm, unquote. Mr. Echols was placed in isolation and on suicide watch. The juvenile facility quickly obtained a court order and sent Mr. Echols to Charter Hospital. Echols had been to Charter in June of 1992 for threatening to kill himself and showing some other violent, disturbing tendencies, and stayed there for several weeks and had been let out to leave for Oregon. had sent Mr. Echols to Charter Hospital for the purpose of determining the appropriate method of referral to a residential treatment facility. Mr. Echols was readmitted to Charter Hospital in Little Rock, Arkansas on September 14, 1992, where he remained until his discharge on September 22, 1992. So he stayed a week or so, right? While driving Echols to Little Rock, Jerry Driver, who is juvenile officer, Jerry Driver asked about the blood-sucking incident. At first, Echols told him it was a joke, quote, and then he said, "That's how you receive power." He said, "I've been doing this for years. And generally it's with willing people," and he had some scars on his arms, and he said he and his girlfriends and other people had done that, and that's how they received power. That's Driver's account of it. Echols' aunt, Patricia Liggett, was given temporary custody so she could admit him to the hospital. And it's interesting, Patricia Liggett, the only comment she had about the case, she seemed to, and later on, the murder case, the killing of Michael Moore, Stevie Branch, Christopher Byers on May 5th, 1993 by Jason Baldwin, Jesse Miskelly, Damien Echols, for which they were convicted and to which they later pleaded guilty. Her attitude was that, she seemed to think that he'd done it. But anyway, that was his aunt. Anyway, charter notes from September 15th indicated Damien's behavior has become frightening to community members in Jonesboro. Had been suspected of witchcraft and/or devil worship prior to incident involving arrest. Again, thought to be suicidal, but not afraid to die, per Damien. Knows he can come back. Dr. Woods reported the provisional diagnoses at Charter Hospital were psychotic disorder, not otherwise specified, and dysthymia. Dysthymia being a type of chronic depression. Staff members immediately noticed Mr. Echols' bizarre behavior, including his growling and making other strange sounds. Mr. Echols also had noticeable problems with attention and concentration. He stared off into space and daydreamed in class and group activities. When staff members attempted to bring him back to the task at hand, he would, quote, then act like he was very startled, as if jolted back into the group process, unquote. Other serious problems noted by staff members include alteration in thought processes, evidenced by delusional thinking and inappropriate social behavior. His appearance was disheveled and unkempt, and he had consistently poor eye contact. He dressed in entirely black clothing, frequently wrote poems and drew pictures of symbols which one staff member erroneously interpreted as closely associated with devil worship. Mr. Echols stated that he was a witch, not a vampire or devil worshiper. Mr. Echols' mood disturbances continued unabated. His affect was extremely flat. He showed absolutely no observable evidence of emotion, and he appeared anxious and uncomfortable. Charter Hospital records reflect that Mr. Echols had almost no insight into the nature or severity of his problems. Like all other staff who observed Mr. Echols over time, he was described by Charter mental health staff as calm, compliant, and cooperative. A psychiatrist noted that even though Mr. Echols had difficulty with reality testing, he related in a very quiet and withdrawn fashion and was actually quite pleasant. Mr. Echols, and this is the Damien that the news media and various entertainment outlets that interviewed him in prison encountered, affable, pleasant, fairly intelligent somewhat soft-spoken young guy. No sign of delusion. Seemed to be quite in control of his senses and his faculties. Which to me indicates that Echols can rein it in when he chooses to, because he always does. He talks about his extreme experiences, extreme experiential and experiences, experiential experiences. His extreme sensory experiences, and his strange observations. Even now, he does from time to time, and even talks about how he's talked about his continuing mental health problems after getting out of prison, but he seems to be able to show up at these political venues and pull off, at least adequate performances, and with no hint that he's, subject matter aside, no hint that he's got some sort of mental health problem. Other than the fact that, he strikes me as being very cold and detached. Draw your own conclusions from that, but he did describe himself as a sociopath. Anyway, back to Mr. Wood's, Dr. Wood's statement here. Mr. Echols was discharged with diagnoses of psychotic disorder, not otherwise specified, and dysthymia. He was released to the care of his stepfather, Andy Echols, who lived in West Memphis, Arkansas. Mr. Echols, he's talking about Damien, was instructed to continue taking his daily dose of 150 milligrams of imipramine and report to the local mental health center for follow-up care. The discharge notes included this pledge: will not participate in occult beliefs. The discharge summary added that Echols had stabilized and no longer needed to be in acute care. Quote, Damien contracted that he will not attempt to harm anyone after time of discharge. Unquote. Mental health professionals considered him a potential risk to others, though his behavior no longer presented immediate problems. And that's it on that chapter. I know that's brief. If I start coughing, I'm going to cut things off, but basically don't have a lot to say about that. I think it stands for itself. It speaks for itself. Echols it's his third trip to mental hospitals in the space of 4 months: June, July, August, and September. We'll describe in the next week or the next chapter his continuing mental health treatment after he got out of the second trip to charter, but before he committed the killings. A lot of disturbing material there. As you can see, this was he was 17 at the time. He was a teenager. He was a young man with some severe mental health problems, some severe attitude problems. Totally unaware and uninterested. He was interested in getting out, and he was interested in complying and getting out. So he, as I say, he could rein it in when he chose to. He's not unlike Ted Bundy, who seemed to, when he chose to, could be an affable, very reasonable, even likable fellow. More so than Echols, I think. I think Bundy was better at playing the game than Echols. He was older and he was more experienced, and he tried harder to fit into society. And I'm not actually equating the two in terms of what I cannot say that Echols is a serial killer, because he's not. Well, Bundy certainly was. I was going to say that there's just a glut of true crime documentaries offered on various streaming services now. The Adnan Syed, the case against. I named this. I was not aware of this series coming up. The case against Adnan Syed on HBO, which has had 2 episodes so far. And I have to say, just what I've seen so far, I don't really get it. I mean, this Adnan guy looks pretty guilty to me. I haven't studied the case closely. In fact, you could say I haven't really studied it all. I know a little bit about it, but not much more than what I've seen in the series so far. And just what I've seen so far, he's got these people who are testifying that he did it. He buried the body. He confessed to them. I know there's more to the story than that, but so far, that's what I'm seeing. And I listened to Serial recently. I'm not a true crime fan as such, not in the hardcore sense. It's something I've indulged in from time to time, but it's not something I'm been heavily involved in, or that I'm heavily involved in away from the West Memphis 3 case. I do have an interest in how journalists and so-called journalists, really they're propagandists disguised as journalists, acting as so-called documentarians who are putting out things such as Making a Murderer, the case against Adnan Syed, the thing on Netflix right now about the Madeline McCann case, which seems to be perceived as an apology for the parents, but thus far, and I've only seen about half the series so far, they're looking pretty guilty too. I'm not saying that if we went to court with them that I could convict them, but they don't look innocent. There's something very funny going on there. I don't know exactly what it is. I don't think anybody else does either. I think in that sense it's a real mystery, but there's something there, and they certainly don't deserve our without some more clarification. I don't think they really deserve our sympathy. They seem to have grossly misled investigators about what was going on, and then there's evidence with the smell dogs that something very strange happened. And at first I wrote it off when they first brought in the dogs. I thought, well, this is a motel room. This is a rental car. All sorts of things can happen here, and it wouldn't be specific to this particular family. And frankly, enough in itself would be enough to throw off enough reasonable doubt to make it difficult to convict in court. If it was their own personal car, it would be different, but a rental car that's used, a hire car as they put it, that's used by lots of people, you know, who knows? Maybe somebody else had a corpse. I mean, it's not, I'm joking, but, you know, it would be just enough. It's not something that I would convict somebody on. But it's certainly enough to go, no, boy, that makes them look pretty guilty. Makes them look guilty of something. I'm not sure exactly what. As far as making a murderer goes, you know, Stephen Avery did it. Brenda Dassey did what he did in the case. He was also guilty of what he was charged with. All the evidence points to that, and what's going on is these movie makers in league with, and Mara Leverett did this with her book, is, you know, these so-called journalists get in league with the defense lawyers, who, as I was listening to Roberta Glass last night in her interview with Meredith Elizabeth, who I've had some dealings with. I consider her to be at least an acquaintance and almost a friend, just on the basis of limited Facebook interaction. Back when Bob Ruff was covering the West Memphis 3, and, you know, Meredith made a very perceptive comment that's absolutely true, that this is what defense lawyers do. They build a case. They present certain limited facts to the jury with the idea that this is what happened, or this is what didn't happen. And that's they're good at that. That's what they do. The ones who are good at it, that's what they do. And what the defense lawyers tend to do is try to, if they don't have anything else, they sow seeds of doubt. And that's what they've done with Avery. That's what they've tried to do with Avery. I think it's backfired at this point. That's what they've tried to do. They've tried to do with the West Memphis 3 pretty successfully for the most part. I think a lot of people bought into that initially. I think Damien's own behavior and the pushback from people who are actually informed about the case is swinging opinions somewhat the other way. But a lot of people still think, oh, those poor boys are innocent. All they did was wear black T-shirts and listen to Metallica. And as far as Adnan Syed, you know, the whole thing seems to revolve around the idea that he's this good little Muslim boy. And, you know, frankly, if he were a good little Protestant boy, I'm not sure that some of these people would be good little white Protestant boy. I'm not so sure some of these people would be all that interested in the case. You know, it's a sort of a paternalistic attitude. I just don't find it that unusual that a 17-year-old, I think he was 17, teenage boy who very well may have been obsessed with his now ex-girlfriend, loses it and kills her in a fit of passion, and then buries the body someplace. You know, that sort of thing happens all the time. I've known people that it's happened to, sadly enough. And very similar circumstances. It's almost generic as far as much of the circumstance. What's unprecedented is the attention given the case. I don't quite get, and again, I don't quite get it. But I guess the serial podcast his friend who's pushed for this, and Chaudhry, and if I'm saying her name correctly, and the Serial podcast, I guess, it threw this unprecedented light on this case that otherwise would be pretty much forgotten, because it is fairly generic as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, I feel like I'm about to cough. I'm signing off.